Hello, and welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm Gabriel Sanders, public programs producer at the museum, and thank you for being with us today. Our partner and presenter of today's event, Behind the Curtain, actors from The Diary of Anne Frank, 70 Years Later, The Forward, and our speakers for today's talk, Adam Langer, Eva Rubinstein, Steve Press, Pauline Hahn, and Peter Dan Levin. We at the museum are committed to our crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. We hope you will spend time here at the museum and visit our exhibitions, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, photographs by Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler, and The Garden of Stones by Andy Goldsworthy. We are looking forward to this fall when we will open Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, our first exhibition for visitors elementary aged and older about the incredible story of the Danish rescue. Our work is supported essentially by your donations and membership. Museum members enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission to our galleries. Learn more at mjhnyc.org/join. Copies of Adam Langer's Cyclorama, a book about today's discussion, are available for purchase at visitor services in our main lobby and online from our Pickman Museum shop at shop.mjhnyc.org. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm pleased to introduce Sam Norwich, the Forwards Association president.
Thank you, Gabriel. I used to be much taller. I was given the aliyah of welcoming everyone and introducing Adam Langer and today's program. As I hope you know, The Forward is a nonprofit independent news organization covering American Jewish life for the past 125 years in Yiddish and now also in English. The Forward has been based in this neighborhood really since its founding, and we're delighted today to be co-presenting this program together with the Museum of Jewish Heritage, of which Jack Klieger is the chief executive. This year, The Forward released a new podcast called Playing Anne Frank, which shares the untold story of how Anne Frank's diary became a beloved award-winning play, and how that play changed the lives of the people who performed it. You'll get to hear from some of those people today, along with the gifted Adam Langer, who created the podcast. You can find Playing Anne Frank on all podcast platforms and on the Forward's own website, forward.com. After the event, I hope you'll visit our website to sign up for our free newsletters and to see the great journalism that we're producing every day. One last thing before I hand things over to Adam. There will be a dessert reception upstairs after the event, and you are invited. Please join us to schmooze and chat. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Adam Langer, the creator and host of Playing Anne Frank. Adam oversees the Forward's arts and culture coverage as our executive editor. He's also the author of a memoir and 6 novels. His latest book, Cyclorama, was named one of the best novels of 2022 by the Chicago Tribune. Adam is a fantastic writer, editor, interviewer, and storyteller. We're all in for a great discussion. Now I'd like to wish you a sweet Pesach, and please join me in welcoming and greeting Adam Langer.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks all of you for making it out here today on this lovely but windy Sunday afternoon. I'd like to start out by thanking Gabriel Sanders and Joshua Mack of the Museum of Jewish Heritage for helping to make this event possible, along with the forward, particularly some folks here and some folks who aren't, Lisa Lepson, Jody Redoran, Matt Littman, and Josh Mandel, who've been integral in both planning the event and helping to plan the podcast. And also one shout out to the co-producers of my podcast, Cole Lacasio and Scylla Shaman, who, she's also the composer who was playing the music that was on when you were walking in the door and now is not playing because I am speaking. Sitting before me on this stage, I have two professors of drama, an internationally renowned photographer, and a prolific director of film and television. But in another time, they were known as Anne and Margot Frank and Peter Van Daan in one of the most influential plays of the 20th century on Broadway, throughout America, and the rest of the world. Of course, The Diary of Anne Frank, the story of the Frank and Van Daan families and their lives in their secret annex in Amsterdam during World War II. A little bit of background just to set you up for the conversation. The Diary of Anne Frank was adapted for the stage by the Hollywood screenwriters Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett. It was directed by Garson Kanin. The set was designed by Boris Aronson and his wife, Lisa Jolowitz. Before it became a play, one of the earliest champions was Eleanor Roosevelt. When I talked to Mrs. Roosevelt, Otto Frank wrote in a letter to the playwrights that I found, one he wrote when they were working on the show, she urged me to give permission for a play and a film, as only then could we reach the masses and influence them by the mission of her book. Anne's wish to work for mankind, to achieve something valuable still after her death, her horror against war and discrimination. The Diary of Anne Frank ran for 717 performances on Broadway at the Court and Ambassador Theaters. It won the Tony Award for Best Play and the Pulitzer Prize. When he reviewed it for the New York Times, Brooks Atkinson said, "Out of the truth of a human being has come a delicate, rueful, moving drama. Strange how the spirit of a young girl now dead can filter down through the years and inspire a group of theatrical professionals in a foreign land." After The Diary of Anne Frank closed on Broadway, it toured big American cities. It went to Chicago, it went to LA and Washington, D.C. And after the national tour, it went on the road again in 1958, this time to 101 American cities, where it became an early form of Holocaust education. It toured Birmingham, Alabama, Fayetteville, Arkansas, Odessa, Texas. In many of the places, as you'll hear today, the audience who saw this play had never heard of Anne Frank before. In some cases, it was the first Jewish story they'd ever heard and the first Jewish people they had ever encountered. In 1959, as you probably know, it became a movie that was nominated for 8 Academy Awards. The Educational Theater Association of America keeps records of the most performed plays in American schools and communities. And for 5 straight decades, The Diary of Anne Frank was one of the top 10. There are only 2 other plays that hold that distinction. Those are Our Town and A Midsummer Night's Dream. So when I had finished writing a novel called Cyclorama about the impact of a fictional production of Anne Frank and what it had on its cast members, I wanted to know the real story of how The Diary of Anne Frank affected the people who brought it to Broadway and beyond. So I started researching the history of The Diary of Anne Frank and how it became a play and a movie. And one of the quotes that stuck with me was an entry from the diary kept by the screenwriter, one of the two screenwriters, Frances Goodrich. She wrote this on January 12th, 1954. Quote, "Finished rough, very rough draft. Starting back at the beginning, this is not like any other job we have done. Terrible emotional impact. I cry all the time." That's a common theme that runs through the stories of the people I've met who have been touched by the Diary of Anne Frank, the ones who created it and brought it to life on the stage. It wasn't like any other play, and it still isn't. It stays with the people who made it, impacts them in a way that other people's and the films have not. In some cases, you could say it actually, literally, changed their lives. I created the podcast, Playing Anne Frank, to explore how the Diary of Anne Frank affected the people who brought it to Broadway, to America, and to Hollywood. And this afternoon, I am really, really, really happy to be joined by 4 people who helped to make the Diary of Anne Frank an unforgettable chapter in the history of theater in America. So today we are joined by Eva Rubinstein, who originated the role of Margot Frank on Broadway, Peter Dan Levin, who originated the role of Peter Van Daan, also on Broadway, Steve Press, who played Peter Van Daan on Broadway, took over the role. He played Peter also on the national tour and the so-called bus and truck tour that played 101 American cities. And also Pauline Hahn, who starred in the 1958 bus and truck tour. She played Anne Frank. So I'm going to be talking to them about their experiences doing the show, what it meant to them, and then we're going to open it up for some questions from you. And I wanted to start, though, to get us kind of into the spirit of things, and this is the point where Pauline and Steve will get out their script. They have the same script, or Pauline has the same script, you can see it's in his binder, that came on the bus and truck tour in 1958. And I am going to ask them to read the final scene of the Diary of Anne Frank that they played in 101 cities across America. The scene is like the rest of the play. It takes place in the secret annex in Amsterdam, not long before their hiding place is discovered by the Nazis. So please welcome Steve and Pauline, who will read the scene before we go into a general discussion.
Look, Peter. The sky. What a lovely, lovely day. Aren't the clouds beautiful? Do you know what I do? When it seems as if I couldn't stand being cooped up for one more minute, I think myself out. I think myself on a walk in the park where I used to go with Pim, where the jonquils and the crocus and the violets grow down the slopes. You know, the most wonderful thing about thinking yourself out, you can have it any way you like. You can have roses and violets and chrysanthemums all blooming at the same time. It's funny. I used to take it all for granted. And now I have gone crazy about everything to do with nature, haven't you?
I've just gone crazy. I think if something doesn't happen soon, if we don't get out of here, I can't stand much more of this.
I wish you had a religion, Peter.
No thanks. Not me.
Oh, I don't mean you have to be orthodox or believe in heaven and hell and purgatory and things. I just mean some religion. It doesn't matter what, just to believe in something. When I think of all that's out there, the trees and flowers and seagulls, when I think of the dearness of you, Peter. And the goodness of the people we know, Mr. Crowler, Meep, Dirk, the vegetable man, all risking their lives for us every day. When I think of these good things, I'm not afraid anymore. I find myself and God, and I...
That's fine. But when I begin to think, I get mad. Look at us, hiding out for 2 years, not able to move, caught like, waiting for them to come and get us. And all for what?
We're not the only people who've had to suffer. There've always been people that have had to. Sometimes one race, sometimes another. And yet...
That doesn't make me feel any better.
I know it's terrible, trying to have any faith when people are doing such horrible. But you know what I sometimes think? I think the world may be going through a phase, the way I was with Mother. It'll pass. Maybe not for hundreds of years, but someday. I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are really good at heart.
I want to see something now, not 1,000 years from now.
But Peter, if you'd only look at it as part of a great pattern, that we're just a little minute in the light. Listen to us going at each other like a couple of stupid grown-ups. Look at the sky now. Isn't it lovely? Someday, when we're outside again, I'm going to... She breaks off as she hears the sound of a car outside. Its brakes squealing as it comes to a sudden stop. The people in the other rooms also become aware of the sound. They listen tensely. Another car outside roars up to a sudden stop. Anne and Peter come from Peter's room. Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan come creeping down the stairs. Dursel comes out from his room. Everyone is listening, hardly breathing. Suddenly, a doorbell rings again and again in the building below.
So I was going to begin in a different place, but now hearing you read that scene, I'd like to start a little bit with the ending, which is what you just read. And I would like to ask any of you who'd like to respond, what was it like that moment to play that ending? The
ending that it goes on further
Of course.
Because we go out to the room and my father, Mr. Frank, goes down to see what's happening, and I think, Peter, did you go after him? Because he's the strongest and young man. And he comes back very quietly, as Mr. Frank is always in touch with his importance as the leader of the group and the one who gives faith to everyone. And he locks the door behind him, and I believe that... What happens with you, Peter? Who takes you?
Nobody.
Nobody. And Mr. Dussel collapses somewhere, and Mrs. Van Daan. And Father, Mr. Frank, whom I call Pim, I, Anne, goes and takes a school satchel for me and everybody, a little bag. And he says, for 2 years, we have lived in fear. Now, we can live in hope. I want to cry just saying it, even though I'm not Mr. Frank. Peter comes and kisses me goodbye. And everybody waits. And oh yes, what happens is there is banging on the doors. Banging, banging. Raus. Let me see. Raus. I can't do it without telling.
Eva, do you remember that moment on stage when the banging came? I think we need your microphone. Sorry.
Yeah, I remember it very well. The first time it happened, rehearsals were sort of, not quite the same. But the first time it happened in performance, I got really scared. It was so real. And we were all so involved in what was going on that that sound just absolutely, froze my blood. I just remember very well.
One of the things that I remember, I think several of you told me when I spoke with you about it, is that when the show was over on Broadway, there was no applause.
Yeah.
There was no
often
applause.
There, you could, this is an audience show, and you could hear the audience, you could feel the audience, you could hear the sobbing as they realize what's going on. And often, when the play ended, there was no applause. There was just the sound of the chairs, and I remember the stage manager coming out. We would line up as the cast, line up in front of the curtain, of the great white curtain, and the stage manager would come out and gesture that there would be no curtain call. And we would just quietly leave the stage, and the audience would leave. It was one of the most moving moments in the history of the theater, what happened.
Now,
I don't actually remember silent audiences on Broadway except for one single night. And that was the night that we were told before the play started that the gentleman who was feeding the Franks all those 2 years, whom we called Mr. Crowler in the play, the actual gentleman was going to be there that night. And the audience was either told or something, I don't remember, but we were told. And I remember that all the sort of extra funny business that had gone on, which happens in a play after some time, little bits of thing, and we had 2 comedians in the play, Jack Guilford and Lou Jacoby, who were irrepressible. So they had added little bits and things. All of a sudden, the whole play was absolutely clean that night. No funny business, no nothing. And when it ended, all of us were completely destroyed anyway. But there was not a sound outside, and there was no curtain call at all. And he came backstage, and he came onto the stage, actually, where we were all waiting for him, and sort of trembling a little bit, just to meet this real person. And he said, yes, it was very close to this. So then we just fell apart.
When, now one of the people who did not see the show was Otto Frank. But I think a couple of you, or actually you, Peter, met him at one point. That's right? Yeah. And you met him after you were done with the show or something?
No, I did 10 months of playing Peter, but I got drafted and had to go into the Army in Fort Dix and Fort Sam Houston, and there was no war going on, and they sent me to Germany, and so I love doing the play, and And I was really excited because there was a cat in the play, and occasionally the cat started to run for the audience, so I would just grab him by the tail and get him back on the stage. But anyway,
Yeah, the cat actually turned out to have a very happy ending in his life. Once you left the show, Arnold Margolin took over the role, and then Steve took over the role, and Steve also took over the cat as it happened.
Was it the same
I
cat?
did. I trained the cat. Taught her. When the show finally ended, no one knew what to do with Mushi. And because he belonged to the show, he had, Garson Kanin and Kip Good had found him at a kennel, and I taught him how to act. And created some wonderful scenes, a couple of wonderful scenes with the cat. And then when the show ended, everyone just gestured, what do we do now? So Mushi came home with me, and then went to live with my mother and father, and spent the rest of his life there, and loved it. My parents
Mushi's acting days were behind him at this point.
Retirement home for cats.
did not go on. Well, actually, I directed a couple of productions after that and did some stock productions. And a couple of times I did bring Mushi with me. But Mushi was not happy with that because he had loved the cast so much.
I'm interested to ask, particularly Eva and Peter, when obviously Steve and Pauline, when you joined the Diary of Anne Frank, its impact was already known. It was a known quantity. But you were there at the very beginning. Did you have any idea that it would make the kind of impact that it did?
No, not at all. But I remember Garson Kanin during all the rehearsals saying, this is not just any old play. This is something special, and we have to be very careful with it and treat it accordingly. And we had a feeling that, we were doing something that was slightly apart from the general theatrical production. So we hoped, in a way, that it would, have some sort of meaning like that. But we couldn't possibly tell. I mean, it could have been a complete flop for all we knew.
And there was actually a second opening, because when we finished the Broadway run, we then convened in Los Angeles. And Garson Kanin said, we've learned so much. We're putting the play back into rehearsal. And it started again. So in LA, we went back into rehearsal and found all those things that I'd have to say that the audience taught us about what the play was. And that became what the road company was as we then began the tour, going from LA, working our way east.
I would like to ask, this can go to any of you, but how much of the story of Anne Frank did you know before you were in the show?
Well, I knew the whole thing. I'd read the book earlier, just when I was still a ballet dancer, and I was in rehearsal, and I had the book with me. So I read it, several years before the play turned up. So I knew the.
So
the whole thing.
Peter, did you have the same experience? Did you know the story before?
No, I didn't. I was in London at a school for actors, and somehow Garson Kanin wanted to see me, and he said, "Do you know who Anne Frank is?" I said, "No." He said, "Come to my hotel. I want you to read this." So I did, and I wrote he was there with his wife and
Ruth Gordon.
Yeah, Ruth Gordon, and I read a scene, and he said, "You got it." And I knew right then and there that as an actor and later as a director. That was the best thing that ever happened to me. And
You know,
Do you know who
Do
your
you
competition was
remember-
for the role, by the way? The
What?
other person they were considering aside from you for the role of Peter?
no,
It's Dennis Hopper.
Oh,
Anyway, they liked Dennis Hopper and they liked you, and they went with you.
I didn't know that.
oh my goodness.
No.
I have
Well,
an answer to your earlier question. I didn't know Dyer Van Frank. I knew nothing about it, even though I was the last one on. I was very young, and I didn't even believe my parents. I thought they were lying to me.
When they told stories of the Holocaust?
Stories of prejudice and just general stories of the Holocaust. I knew enough because I had sung Anima Amin at the 1945 fundraising for Palestine. And so I knew something about it because everybody there was trying to get money for Palestine after the war. But I didn't know the play, and I'd not read the play, and I didn't believe anything to do with my parents. I was ashamed that I was of the Jews who always make up stories.
And Steve, what was your experience of beforehand?
Well, before the war, I knew about this because my mother was born in Germany. And when she came over here, she left behind many friends and family. I remember during the 1930s, I had a wonderful stamp collection because in those days people wrote letters. And then suddenly, 1939, 1940, everything stopped.
The letters stopped.
Everything stopped. And then no more letters, no more stamps for my stamp collection. And then we all went to war during the Second World War. Even us kids during the war were doing things in America, collecting scrap paper and scrap metal and looking sell bonds. And then 1945, 46, 47, my mother and the family that was here started searching and writing letters and calling and seeing. All were gone. Not one person in Europe was left. My mother then at that point shut down about the war and the Holocaust until we finally got a letter from a cousin who had made it to South Africa. And that was the only person of the family who had stayed in Europe that survived the Holocaust.
My father lost about 100 people from his family.
Yeah,
There was
same.
one cousin who got to Israel, and one cousin, well, my cousin, except she was 45 years older than I was, because my father had much older siblings, who made it to America, actually, but that was it. And then, of course, the Soviets took care of my mother's non-Jewish
Yes.
family and sent them all to Siberia, so
Yeah.
they pretty well knocked out the family between them.
And Eva, you and your father and your mother and your brother, you left Europe right when war was about to break up.
It had begun, yeah. We were in Deauville in Normandy, the summer of '39. And my grandmother, who had a house in Lithuania, was staying with us, and my mother was trying to keep her from going back to Lithuania, which is on the other side of Poland, because she was afraid, the war things were going on already. There'd been a couple of air raids, false alarms, but nightmares things. And she went back anyway. And then literally a week later, it was the 1st of September, and Warsaw was bombed, and it was too late. She was stuck there for the whole war. So we got on a boat, an American boat, thanks to the American ambassador in Paris. And it was the last boat taking Americans out of Europe, called the George Washington, which had so many people on it that they had to serve every meal 3 times, so dining room was just going the whole time. And it was all the women and children on one side and all the men on the other, because it was just a mob, you know. I'll never forget that trip. It was amazing.
How much of these experiences you with letters?
Can I talk?
Absolutely. Yes. Please.
Well, when I was in Germany, I bought a car, and I knew where Otto Frank lived, and I drove down into Basel, and we had a wonderful afternoon, and I have his letter here. It's a bit long, so I won't read it all, but he just didn't want to watch the play. He couldn't. But he says, well, I can't really see it. My computer doesn't like me. But he gave me the names in Amsterdam of all the people that had saved the people, and I went. I drove up there and I saw it, and it was really it was very depressing. But so
how much of these experiences and your knowledge of the history as you came to learn it came into your performance when you were in the Diary of Anne Frank? Like Eva, like your experience leaving Europe, Steve with the letters from Europe, did that enter into, or
Well, it made it a little more real.
Of course.
I mean, we knew what they were talking about, you know.
Yeah, and that and the audience. The audience never stopped communicating with us. There were, in reality, there were 3 audiences that came to the play. This was the 1950s, and one audience, of course, was the older audience, who were so tightly affiliated with the Holocaust, because the stories of the Holocaust were still coming in. The second audience was the young people, because what happened was the older audience would then come back to see the play again and bring with them their children and grandchildren to see the history. And that audience was totally different, because their contact was not Otto and Anna, but it was with Peter and Anna. And the communication between the audience and between Anna and Peter was unbelievable. They would cheer and whistle when Peter kisses Anna.
And you howl.
They would howl and scream, and it very beautiful. And from then on in, the play just went on and on and on.
And that didn't happen on Broadway, you said? No, that was only during the national tour,
Yeah,
when
no.
audiences were a little less buttoned up.
A little loosened up, yeah.
Yeah.
No, Broadway was
Well, when I
fully-
was in Germany, I went to Stuttgart, and I saw the play there, and it was phenomenal. I knew it, you know. I knew a little German words then, and because I knew a little Yiddish, and I went to see it, and you said it. The audience didn't move at the end; they just didn't know. And I went backstage, and I said, "Okay, I'm a Schauspieler," and I introduced myself, and this woman's name was Gustl Halenke, and we became friends for the last 63 years. And she and her husband, who was an actor, but he was also a Nazi. He would shoot planes and things. But they came over, and we saw them in New York, and we saw them a lot over the years, and he was a wonderful actor, but he died, and Gustl died recently, but it's.
One thing that interests me.
Do you remember the nights? Well, as we do a play week after week and month after month, it becomes, there's a certain rhythm that develops. We just do it, and we know that this happens, and then the door closes, and then this opens, and that happens, and this happens. And one night, there was a scene where I'm sitting on the couch downstage, and there's a noise downstairs, and it's evening, and you're trying to turn off the lamp, the overhead lamp.
Yes.
And it
And he
was
falls.
always, the lamp drops.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
scream.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, one night, the lamp didn't drop on the cue. I screamed anyway. You know? Oh, my God. I don't know if you remember that, but that was my one inattention moment.
There's such a difference between the response of the audience in the tour that I was in, and what I hear from Steve. We had a lot of young people, and my favorite place of the 101 stops was in Bloomington, Indiana, where when I said, Peter, have you ever kissed a girl? Titters from the entire audience. I was speaking to people, I was 15, and I was speaking, and turned out 16, people my own age, and they were giggling as if they were Anne.
The four of you, when Jerry Van Frank was on Broadway and on the tour, some of the actors were Jewish, some of them weren't. I believe all four of you are Jewish or of Jewish heritage. Did that enter at all? Was that important at all in playing these roles?
Well,
It
as
was
I said,
only important-
yes, because of my mother, it certainly struck home with me.
Well,
I didn't know of any
sorry.
other, I didn't care and think about who was Jewish and not, except that Steve, I was not really close with anybody in the cast. I was busy concentrating on new things that I would do each day. But Steve came to me one day and said, there is in Charlotte, North Carolina, there is a Jewish newspaper, and would you like to come with me to meet the editor? That's when I realized that nobody else was Jewish except us. But it made no difference. Isn't that amazing?
Was that Harry Golden? We were
I don't remember, but
the Carolina Israelite.
yes.
Was that the paper? Yeah.
It was the only newspaper, and we went to see him. And although I believe that in the tour we had very little communication, I was only interested in Lilia Scala, who was teaching me acting. She didn't know she was teaching me acting, but I was her student.
Peter, you wanted to add something there?
Well, when I was in Germany, the Stuttgart it was a wonderful, if you had to be in the army, it's the best thing to do. The 7th Army shows had a jazz band, a philharmonic, and a theater. And so we were kind of like a bus and truck tour, and we go all through the cities where the Nazis had been, and we did Arsenic and Old Lace, Boy Meets Girl, and Dial M for Murder, and we went all over from Munich all the way up, and we'd have to unload the scenery, and you know, as Adam said, who's going to watch it? And I said, well, the soldiers. And so that was, you know, as we'd unload the scenery and all that, some of them would come along and say, hey, where's the movie? And I said, there is no movie. And they said, well, what the fuck? What is there? And I said, well, it's a theater. It's a theater. And they said, we never saw that. And I said, all right. Just try to go in and look at it. And so they went in and they looked at it, and some of them came out and said, okay, I'll be an actor.
We saw, just bringing us a little bit to the present, a few weeks ago, the show Parade about Leo Frank on Broadway was picketed by neo-Nazis who, for whatever reason, and we don't need to go into that. I'm curious, 1950s, doing the Diary of Anne Frank on Broadway and throughout America, was there any anti-Semitism that you experienced?
Yes, of course.
In New Orleans, we had wonderful reviews, fantastic reviews all through until we got to New Orleans. I was so eager to go to New Orleans, the banana boats, and well, we arrived, and we were there for several days, and I was invited to meet the ladies of New Orleans for tea. Well, it was a very large place, and it was very beautiful, everything excellent, and these 5 ladies or so, dressed beautifully and sitting very primly, and one of them said to me, we understand that you are Jewish. Isn't that wonderful? At that point, I knew that no Jew had ever been in that place. And what do I answer? I was only a child. And I said something like, well, I guess, yeah, yes, it is. That was the last conversation. We had our tea. Wait. We played our first night. The next morning, there were the reviews. And I've seen just yesterday that there was a good review, but the major newspaper wrote, and I quote, the acting was terrible, the directing was worse, the scenes were awful, the lighting was ghastly, and besides, it's a lie. It never happened.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was, I mentioned before that there were 2 audiences. There was a 3rd audience. And they would react to a line that Otto Frank says at the Hanukkah. He's being humorous in the character and says, did we start the war? Did we start the war?
Isn't that fun done?
Was it fun done?
Yeah, because Tim would not say that.
But
it was fun done.
But often someone in the audience would shout, yes, you did. It was all your fault.
On Broadway, did that happen ever? Anything like that, Eva? Peter?
Mostly on the road.
Did that ever happen on Broadway? Anything of that?
Not that I know of. I'm sorry, not that I know of. No. Did happen, however, in Poland not too long ago. I was in the very, very new and quite extraordinary, in Warsaw, it's called the Museum of the History of the Polish Jew. And it's absolutely amazing place. If you have 12 hours with nothing to do, go there, because it's just extraordinary. And I was there for the first time with a very, very close friend, and she was sort of chauffeuring me around the place. And we got to a certain exhibit of a town called Jedwab, something like, I'm not sure is the word for silk, where there was a horrendous event back during the war, where the Jews were gathered up and locked up in a church, which was then set on fire. And the Poles simply deny it. They just say it didn't happen. So we were standing in front of the exhibit about that. And as my friend is talking to me, a woman about 20 feet away yells at us, "It's a lie, it's a lie, it's a lie."
It's a lie.
None of that happened. It never happened.
And especially in Galicia, they, I don't know whether it's always Germans or Poles, but mostly Ukrainians, I think, would take all the Jews and put them, lead them into the shul and lock the door and light it on fire. Or if they were bored, they would line all the Jews up. They made them dig the trenches, and they'd line them up, and then machine gun them.
The Jewish cemetery in the city of Lodz, Łódź, where my father was born, the Jewish cemetery still has an enormous trench dug along the main wall where they didn't manage to get everybody killed and buried there, but the trench is still there that they dug.
My grandmother died that way.
Well, when I came back from Germany, I think I told you this. You know, it wasn't easy to get a job. Garson Kanan gave me another job with Henry Fonda and Olivia de Havilland. I had 5 parts in it, and I don't know how I could do that.
How did you?
I mean, 5 parts. And so I was also the assistant stage manager.
Because you were so bored.
I hope they paid you 5 times.
Yeah, so.
But what we're hearing, though, is the importance of this play, that it never stops shouting out to the world about what happened and the anti-Semitism that continues to happen, and that we must, and that's why the play is done again and again and again.
As actors, how hard was it for you up on stage when you know the ending and you know that what the banging on the door will mean in Act 2? How hard is it to keep that out of your mind when you're trying to play the everyday lives of these characters?
Not at all hard.
Not at all.
I was always in the moment.
No, because you're busy. You're busy
just-
doing.
I was Anne.
It's just part of the
So
business.
I was Anne in every moment. I remained Anne, and when the butt of the gun was heard, I was shocked
It was always a
every
shock.
time, because I didn't know what was happening later.
Well, my acting career was a little tough, and I couldn't get a job as a waiter. So I decided to become a director. And if you watched some of the television, I've done 57 movies for television and series, and I never did a feature, you know, but
That leads me to ask each of you. Now, as I said, when I introduced you as a director, a photographer, professors. For all of you, in some way, like, The Diary of Anne Frank was the pinnacle of the acting career, I would hazard to say. Why did you decide at a certain point that you wanted to do something else?
Well, I got married 2 weeks after I left the show. It's the only reason I left the show. was because I was getting married and leaving New York. I was going to live in New England for a good many years. So that it's not that I went to another,
The answer is complex,
another
really,
career or
because
something. That
we
was
were in
much
New
later.
York, and this was the 60s, and the 60s in New York were very difficult. New York had been the beginning of television. I mean, I was doing Studio Ones and Playhouse 90.
did that too.
Yeah,
Huh?
and it was wonderful. But it was all live. They really needed trained stage actors for television. So we were there. We were trained for the stage, and when a Studio One production would open at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, you were on. You could not make any mistakes, and only the stage actor was really trained for that kind of thing. But AFTRA is now affiliated with the Screen Actors Guild because that doesn't exist anymore.
And they mumble.
Everything is film, film, or it's not even film anymore. It's electronics. It's all digital. So, but what a wonderful world it was in the 60s when television was here in New York. Wonderful.
I did a great deal of television. I think over 500 TV appearances.
And you also were one of the original actors in the original Broadway production
A
of
Cat on a Hot Tin Roof.
as well.
The reason I wasn't auditioning or considered for Daria Van Frank is because I was a no-neck monster. I wasn't old enough to play Anne. I wasn't nearly old enough. I was 15 when I auditioned, but I turned 16 on the road, and there wasn't another Anne who was my age. They were usually 21, 19. Of course, Millie Perkins, I don't know, but all of the actresses I knew of, Susan Strasberg was 21, I think.
No, she was 18 when it started.
And then then it was
Then she was
19,
got older as well.
20. Anyway, I
That's
was
what-
15, and I was a very, very sheltered 15. And as you can see, I didn't have much idea of what was going on in the world, or else I would have realized that there had been a Holocaust. I didn't know until I got a little Dell book when I got the role, and I opened this little paperback book and saw the pictures, and I don't remember a greater shock in my entire life.
I can imagine.
And I never told my parents.
Do you know Norman Lloyd?
He
He died.
he was like the oldest working actor in America
Yeah,
for a time,
yeah.
yeah.
And
And like was in Hitchcock in the 1930s.
Yeah, yeah.
Norman
Was that-
Lloyd.
Norman Lloyd.
And why
Yeah.
do you bring him up?
Well, because he told me a lot of jokes.
Is there a good joke that you would share?
Well, yes. Some taxi driver was sitting at LaGuardia, and a famous, I can't remember his name, but he was getting off the plane, and he got into the cab, and the taxi driver was Jewish. He said, "So, Mr. What are you doing here in New York?" He said, "Well, I'm going to play King Lear." He said, "Really? How do you think it'll go in English?"
I didn't
Joke
hear
for the
that.
forward audience, absolutely. I want to ask one final question of you, and then I want to open it up to the audience. The premise of the podcast I was doing was that this one particular play, this Diary of Anne Frank, impacted not only the audience, but the people who were in it. How would you say it changed, if at all, how will you say that being in the Diary of Anne Frank changed or impacted you?
There's no end to how it impacted me. For one thing, I became Jewish. Because I was thinking like people who weren't Jewish or who were enemies. But also, most importantly, it was my master class. I had never studied acting. Of course, I could say that I studied with a great many people, but they didn't know I was studying with them. But I made every 101 performances a task, an intense and perfect instruction for myself, what I was working on. In the last 2 weeks, I was desperate because there weren't enough days for all the things I'd had planned. It was my maturation as an actress. And of course, I had so many different types of scenes in which to learn acting. I think that I felt that I was becoming a mature professional. Although I'd been a professional from age 2.5, I felt that this was making me a professional. Of course, the trouble is that when I had so many excellent reviews, I was asked to audition for a film in which I would star in London. And that is when the wheels came off the cart. Because when I arrived in London, it was about a girl who was unfortunate and in a poor home and so forth. I arrive in London, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning. The entire tarmac is filled with news reporters from 3 countries, and there were bright lights. I don't know, the kind of lights that you would think police would use, and they were all there to meet the star. Me, the star? Oh, hello. And they then take me to a hotel room, and they want to take pictures. And, okay, I was very, very tired, and my eye crosses when I'm tired. And the next morning, there are front page pictures of me. One photographer took picture from this down, and so it showed décolletage. Oh, she's here to be a bad girl. I'm an Orthodox Jewish girl who was put out of a temple because 6-year-old girls were not allowed because they could become the sirens that women were. I was there to be a bad girl. It followed with a great many such things. I was invited to talk to a news lady, and she wrote that I had a long cigarette holder and talked about my past and all kinds of nonsense. I went to my hotel room and sobbed myself into red, swollen eyes. I would be taken to the studios of the film that I was doing by the chauffeur-driven Rolls Royce. Of course, I was all yes, me, with the star on this and the star on that. And I was treated essentially, they must have thought just what I did. I thought I was in Shakespeare's London, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. I have reached the top. And they thought they had, an American girl, an American actress. She wouldn't mind lifting her skirts and doing this and that. And I refused. They had to get somebody else. And the experience and the trauma, and of course rape was part of it. I had my ticket to go to Hollywood to do the Song of Ruth. And I didn't take the ticket. I ran away as fast as I could.
So the Diary of Anne Frank had kind of set up this kind of world of what acting could be, and then London taught you another side of what...
Grotesque.
Yes.
It was obscene. And I had nobody to talk to. My brother was there as my chaperone because I was under 18, but he went off the first day. And I couldn't understand why people said that I was speaking the way that she wrote that I was speaking. I felt that if I went to Hollywood, if this is what I saw in the home of Shakespeare, what could I expect in Hollywood? I wouldn't live till the end of the month.
Steve, what did being in Anne Frank teach you? How did it affect you? Did it change you?
Oh, in a sense, part of the problem was I became so typecast playing 16-year-olds that, that as I got older, in my 20s, I would be called out for roles, and the director said, geez, you can't play this part anymore. And it became too difficult. So the 60s were, and as I said before, the 60s were a rough time in New York as everything was changing. And at some point I was offered a professorship, and that was what a wonderful job that is, because I could choose the plays I want to direct, and I was in a location where a great variety of casting, and I was doing Shakespeare and Ibsen and Chekhov and contemporary pieces. It was wonderful. And then on even more than that, I met my wife, and we had wonderful children, and what more could I want?
Eva, what did you learn? Or how did, if at all, how did being Anne Frank impact you, would you say?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, you.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, as I said, I left the play after a year and a half, and I got married about 4 weeks later, and moved to New England, and this was December 12th, the wedding, Christmas holiday. My husband was then temporary chaplain at Andover School in Massachusetts. And the first thing I did was play Cordelia with a 16-year-old fantastic Lear in the senior play. So I never quit.
Well, it's a good role.
As I said, I directed the play many times.
Oh, yeah. No, I think of the stage, you have acted and directed probably Anne Frank more than anybody in the world.
Probably.
You played it in the national tour. You played it on Broadway.
Yeah.
Bus and truck tour. You directed it in New York, at Dutchess County. So.
Yes, I did, and I got. I'm very proud that in '04, when I directed a production in New York City, I got a great review in the New York Times, and I was really pleased about that.
Did you see the all-family group of Eli Wallach and his wife and 2 daughters played it?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Instead of acting in film, I went on to do a great deal of experimental theater around the world. Lived in China, India, Israel, a number of countries.
And as 2 people
Europe.
in our audience can attest to, at least Poughkeepsie, New York, as well.
And Poughkeepsie, New York.
I'd like to open it up actually to the audience, and I will.
Well, wait.
No, I will open the audience in a moment.
Well,
Peter.
when I graduated high school in Trenton, New Jersey, they put this thing. It's called the Baba Sheila. What person goes where, and so they said, "Oh, you're going to be a bachelor." But I got married, and I got married to somebody that's wonderful, and she's 63 years, and she's waiting for me at home, and she's a great writer and was a great actress. Didn't want to be anymore. She said, I like the rehearsals, but I hate the performance.
Yeah.
So
I understand that. I always liked rehearsals better than anything. because you feel something growing and happening and changing every day. And once it's set, then you just have to keep it going, keep it alive all the time. But it's not the same.
I love it.
So let's, I see a question over here. Can you, no, we can go back and forth with this. Sure. What?
So my great uncle was actually in a replacement cast member, I think, in the Broadway production, and then on one of the road tours. And I know he was blacklisted. And I also seem to recall that Jack Guilford had been blacklisted. And given, Mr. Langer, your account of the play, certainly the road tour, as having a kind of political impulse. And
it's true. I was blacklisted too. It was very common during that period.
Well, I was just wondering if if there was some thought put into, or you heard discussion about the play as a political project.
First of all, can you tell us who your great uncle was?
Oh, sure, of course. His name was Gilbert Green.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, I
Because
know.
I have a picture of Gil.
I'm sure. Yeah, and in fact, I think a little mortified to say this because he must have been middle-aged, but I know that he and Carol Guilford, who
played
that they
Margot.
became an item, and she became a popular cookbook writer, and a lot of her cookbooks have recipes from Gil. Yeah.
Did you bring any snacks with you?
No, not brisket, not potato
I guess the question
pancakes,
that we
which were
have
the
out of that
recipes.
is, now, when the Diary of Anne Frank went on the road particularly, there was a very conscious attempt that this was a form of educating the American public. It wasn't just doing a play. So there was a political aspect to it as well.
There's a backstory to that. It happens that I'm not just an actress, but I did a lot of research and teaching. And so what I'm about to tell you is based on real research. The Works Progress Administration, which was Roosevelt's baby, was run by Harry Hopkins. And Harry Hopkins happened to have met Hallie Flanagan at Grinnell, and he asked her to become the head of the Federal Theater Project. She had a Guggenheim years before in which she studied European drama throughout, and at the time there was no nastiness of feeling for or against Russia, and she studied the Russian theater and was impressed with the fact that they had theater in every little place in all of what was Russia. And she took that information and made it into her format. There were, I didn't look at the books yesterday, but I think there must have been at least 300 theaters that she created during 35 through 38 at the head of the Federal Theater Project, the only national theater we ever had. And it was absolutely wonderful, but one of her most important creations was the living newspaper. And this was what we would call, what's the word, Ariel? Documentaries today. And it was very serious. The first one was about the Constitution. The second one was about the I have word retrieval problems.
So she was doing documentary theater.
And the one that was planned was lynching in the South. Well, the Southern senators, it was opposite. The Democrats were conservative and so forth. Anyway, the Southern senators threatened Roosevelt that he would not get his third term if it wasn't thrown under the bus. And 300, maybe 350 theaters were axed in one day. In fact, the committee that did so was the place where Nixon cut his teeth. It was the Dies Committee.
And that's where the Diary of Anne Frank wound up playing some of those theaters, right?
Well, of course.
Yeah.
Well, no, Diary of Anne Frank was not played yet.
Yeah, but it
What
was,
happened is that for 30 years, none of these places had a theater. Kermit Blumengarten had the courage to send Anne Frank to every little place he could, from Maine to the 2/3 of Texas. And he, in Baltimore, when we played at Baltimore, this was truck and bus. In the morning, Diary of Anne Frank was painted over on both of them because they feared violence. And what we did, our little group, we resurrected regional theater in America. We brought back Hallie Flanagan, who was the mother of regional theater. And that's what I feel. Our tiny little group who was going bus and truck to 150 places, every single one of them had not seen
and we would
theater.
As we traveled by bus, we would be followed by a police cruiser because they were afraid. And then at every performance, there was always a police officer standing in the back of the theater.
Let's, any other questions that we have? I see a gentleman all the way in the back.
Thank you for this very interesting the history of the Anne Frank play. I'm curious, going forward, to keep the message alive and to keep the play alive, do you see that it will continue to be shown to the audiences that need to see it? And in what languages has it been done? Is it being done in Yiddish for people who are from the ultra-Orthodox community? Is it being done throughout Europe and Asia and so forth?
I mean, the Diary of Anne Frank remains one of the most performed plays both in America and throughout the world. And one of the most interesting things I did to me, after I had talked to the folks you see on stage, I talked to a lot of folks in small American communities like Waynesville, North Carolina, and Duluth, Minnesota, and a number of other cities. And it continues to resonate in these cities. Just last week, I spoke to a woman in Pauline's favorite town, Bloomington, Indiana, and 2 weeks ago, the opera of Anne Frank premiered.
Really?
Written by the Pulitzer Prize-winning composer Shulamit Ron. So it is still out there. It is still playing in all these communities throughout America, throughout the world. Sam Norwich has a question. Yes.
It occurs to me that more American Jews who did not have either a personal or an extended family connection with the Holocaust learned about the Holocaust through the various incarnations of Anne Frank's story.
Absolutely.
Through the book published in '52 in English, through the Broadway play in '55 and its tours in '58 and onward, and through the film that premiered in March of '59. I think Wiesel's Night only appeared in English in 1960. So I think more Americans learned about what happened through this story than through any other single source. Is that not correct?
I learned about what happened through this play. I didn't believe it. I didn't believe
Yeah,
my
I mean,
parents.
it is true that the Diary of Anne Frank has become, or was for a time, a de facto form of Holocaust education. Now, Peter, I see you brought a couple of books with you, speaking
Oh,
of
yes.
Holocaust education. Was there anything you wanted to tell us about the books that you brought? And I can pass them out.
There's a magazine in certain places about Anne Frank, but I have these books, The Diary of a Young Girl, and the other one is good, Anne Frank Remembered,
Yes.
by Miep Gies.
Yes, by Mape.
The Hidden Life of Otto Frank is really
Oh,
interesting.
that I didn't read.
I'm going to use my projecting voice rather than borrowing phone. I'm told we have time for one more. I think they can hear me, but yeah. For one more question. So, does we have one more? And yes, we have one over here.
Have any of you seen Leopoldstadt, and do you see any parallels between that and the Diary of Anne Frank?
I can't
The
hear.
question is, have any of you seen Tom Stoppard's play Leopoldstadt, and do you see parallels?
No, I haven't seen it.
I
but
have seen it. And Anne Frank is still much more powerful. Leopoldstadt works, but it retells the story, and it's a long play. The third act is absolutely wonderful, but it's the terrible conclusion again of, once again, people being killed in the Holocaust. But it takes a while to get there.
Eva, have you seen the show?
No, I haven't, but my brother John, who's an actor, did see it, and he wrote an email about this long with all sorts of criticisms, at the end of which he said, but you should see it anyway. But read it first, which I did. So I read it, and I will eventually go see it, I will. I haven't seen it.
Eva, speaking of her brother, the actor John Rubinstein, who will be seen this summer in the...
In June.
In
Yeah,
June,
yeah.
in a one-man show about Dwight D. Eisenhower.
It sounds weird, but it's wonderful.
Anyway, sorry, let's have one more question over here, since we're very enthusiastic. Then it'll take a little time for Gabriel to go over there with the microphone. He's on his way.
Good exercise for him.
Good exercise.
Thank you for this wonderful afternoon. Is it possible, have any of your performances been filmed?
I don't
Have
think
any
Is
of
it
the
possible
shows,
to see
have
them?
any of the productions been filmed? And I think the answer to that question is no.
No.
And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast series, is you had 717 performances on Broadway, you had the Boston Truck Tour, the national tour, more than 1,000 performances,
And
there is
nothing.
no record of it.
And no cast, no
there
cast
was
to
there was
photos.
a 1959 Hollywood film with Millie Perkins, but actually film of the stage production, no.
No.
No, that
And-
would, we'd have to really talk about copyright laws now.
Exactly. Okay, I want to first invite everyone. After this, we will be going upstairs to the Locks Cafe. If people would like to talk to our guests, I would like to thank the opportunity to thank the Museum of Jewish Heritage and the Forward, and Steve Press, Pauline Hahn, Eva Rubinstein, and Peter Dan Levin, excuse me.
Anger too. As I mentioned at the start, copies of Cyclorama are available for purchase at the front desk. Thanks so much for coming.